Tales by Imon. Let's start the story. The autumn chill of Havenwood Gap, Pennsylvania, had a way of seeping into your bones, a damp, persistent cold that clung to the hollows long after the sun had risen. For Detective Jack Callahan, it was a feeling he remembered all too well. A feeling he'd spent the last decade in Philadelphia trying to forget. But Havenwood Gap, with its whispering pines and secrets buried deeper than the coal seams in the surrounding mountains, had a way of calling its own back. This morning, the call had come in the form of a static-laced dispatch, pulling him from a half-finished cup of coffee at the town's only diner. A vehicle, abandoned. Location, an old, decommissioned service road just off the eastbound lane of Interstate 80, a stretch of asphalt known more for its monotonous scenery than for any real trouble. As his unmarked cruiser bumped down the gravel path, the scene unfolded exactly as Sheriff Brody had described it over the radio. A late-model Subaru Outback, silver gray, was parked neatly on the shoulder, almost as if the driver had pulled over to admire the view. Except there was no view, just a thick, impenetrable wall of hemlock and oak, their branches skeletal against the pale morning sky. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face was a roadmap of his 60-plus years in these mountains, stood by the driver's side door, his arms crossed over his barrel chest. He nodded as Jack got out, the crunch of fallen leaves under Jack's boots sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. "Morning, Callahan," Brody grunted. His voice was like rocks grinding together. "Figured I'd call you in. This one feels off." Jack pulled on a pair of latex gloves, his eyes already scanning. He'd learned to trust Brody's gut. The old sheriff might not know the latest forensic techniques, but he knew the rhythm of this town. And this was a break in that rhythm. "What have we got?" Jack asked, his gaze sweeping the perimeter. No tire tracks other than the Subarus and their own. No footprints in the damp soil, save for Brody's and his deputies. Cars registered to a Liam and Chloe Sterling. Address out of Portland, Oregon. Looks like they were heading east. "Cross-country move, maybe," Brody explained, gesturing toward the packed interior of the car. Boxes, suitcases, a sad-looking houseplant wedged in the back. "Deputy ran the plates an hour ago. No flags. No bolo. They're not wanted. As far as the world is concerned, they don't exist as a problem." "Until now," Jack murmured, approaching the driver's side. The door was unlocked. He opened it carefully. The first thing that hit him wasn't an odor of decay or violence, but the faint, mundane smell of coffee and cinnamon. A half-eaten bag of trail mix sat on the center console. The keys were still in the ignition. "They left in a hurry?" Jack mused aloud. "Doesn't feel like it," Brody countered, shaking his head. "Look at the passenger seat." Jack leaned over. A smartphone sat screen up in a cup holder, plugged into a charging cable. A woman's purse was on the floor, its contents undisturbed. Wallet, keys to a different vehicle, lipstick. Everything a person would take, even if they were just stepping out for a minute. "You checked the phone?" Jack asked. "It's locked. We'll need a warrant to crack it." But the last thing on the screen before it timed out was the GPS. The deputy, a young kid named Evans, chimed in. The route was set for New York City, but the last search, that was for a local spot. Jack's interest peaked. "What spot?" "Place called Whispering Falls," Evans said, shrugging. "Never heard of it. Not on any current map I can find." Jack straightened up, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. Whispering Falls. He hadn't heard that name in 20 years. It wasn't a real place. Not anymore. It was a local ghost story, a lover's leap point that had been fenced off and reclaimed by the forest decades ago after a series of tragedies. Why would a couple from Oregon, passing through on a superhighway, be searching for a forgotten piece of local lore? He walked around to the back of the car. The trunk was closed. He popped it open. More boxes, all neatly taped. Nothing seemed out of place. No signs of a struggle. No blood, no broken glass, no frantic scuff marks on the upholstery. It was the cleanest, most orderly potential crime scene he had ever witnessed. And that was what made it so terrifying. Liam and Chloe Sterling hadn't been dragged from their car. They had, it seemed, simply stepped out of it and vanished into the dense, silent woods of Pennsylvania. "We should start a grid search," Jack said, his voice tight. "Call in volunteers if we have to." They couldn't have gone far. Sheriff Brody stared into the dark woods, his expression grim. "In these woods, Callahan? A person can get turned around in 10 minutes. If they were out here all night, the temperature dropped below 40. Jack knew he was right. The silence of the forest was deceptive. It was a living thing, ancient and indifferent. It swallowed sounds, it swallowed light, and sometimes it swallowed people. He took a few steps away from the car, his eyes scanning the tree line. He was looking for anything out of place, a scrap of fabric, a broken branch, a sign of passage. His gaze fell on a large moss-covered oak tree about 20 yards from the road. Something was hanging from one of its lower branches, twisting gently in the imperceptible breeze. He walked toward it, a sense of dread growing with each step. It wasn't a piece of clothing or a forgotten item. It was small, intricately made. As he got closer, his breath caught in his throat. Hanging by a piece of twine was a small, crudely fashioned doll. It was woven from twigs, dried grass, and what looked like dark strands of human hair. Its arms were outstretched, its body thin and brittle. It wasn't a child's toy. It felt like a warning, a marker, an effigy. Jack had seen a lot of things in his time as a detective in Philadelphia. He'd seen the worst of what people could do to each other, but he had never seen anything like this. It was something born of old fears, of deep woods and whispered stories told around a dying fire. He turned back to Sheriff Brody, holding the strange object carefully by its twine. The old sheriff's face went pale, his eyes wide with a recognition that Jack didn't understand. "Brody," Jack said, his voice low. "What the hell is this?" The sheriff didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the twig doll, then back at the silent, waiting forest. "It means," Brody finally said, his voice barely a whisper, "that they didn't just wander off. They were taken." The twig doll felt heavier than it looked in Jack Callahan's gloved hand. It was a nexus of primal fear, a relic from a time when the woods held dominion over the imaginations of men. Sheriff Brody's words hung in the cold air, dense and foreboding. They were taken. It wasn't a hypothesis, it was a statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of a man who had seen this before. Back at the sheriff's department, the doll sat in an evidence bag on Jack's temporary desk, an object of macabre fascination. The building smelled of stale coffee and damp paperwork, a stark contrast to the crisp, unnerving air of the forest. "So you're telling me this thing," Jack said, tapping the bag with his pen, "is some kind of calling card? From who?" "The Blair Witch." Brody sighed, sinking into his worn leather chair, which groaned in protest. "Laugh all you want, Callahan. You city boys come up here thinking everything can be explained away by forensics and psychology. Some things are just old. And this is old." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "When I was a kid, my grandpappy told me stories. Stories about the first settlers in these mountains. They'd find these things, these little stick men, on the edge of their property. It was a warning, a claim. The old ones, the spirits of the woods, they were saying, 'This belongs to us now.' People who didn't heed the warning, they'd vanish. Whole families, sometimes." Jack ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. "Brody, we're looking for a missing couple, Liam and Chloe Sterling. Not a ghost story. We need facts, evidence, not folklore." "The doll is evidence," Brody insisted, his gaze unwavering. "It's a signpost. It's telling us where to look." "And where is that?" "Not where," Brody corrected. "But what? We're not looking for a simple kidnapper. We're looking for someone who knows the old ways. Someone who still believes in them." The conversation was interrupted by Deputy Evans, who burst into the office, his young face flushed with excitement. "We got into the phone. The tech guys down in Harrisburg bypassed the lock screen." Jack was on his feet instantly. "Finally. Something concrete. What did you find?" Evans swiped through the phone, a high-end smartphone that felt alien in the rustic office. "Not much in their recent calls or texts. Mostly family, friends back in Oregon. Moving logistics. But their photo gallery, there's something weird." He turned the phone around. The last photo taken was time-stamped just before 9 p.m. the previous night. It wasn't a selfie or a scenic shot. It was a picture of the dark woods, illuminated only by the car's headlights. The quality was grainy, but in the center of the frame, just at the edge of the light's reach, 2 pinpricks of light shone back. They were too high off the ground to be a deer or a coyote. They looked like eyes. "Animal," Jack suggested, though he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office's drafty windows. "Maybe," Evans said, zooming in. The image pixelated, but the eyes remained, a steady, unwavering gleam in the oppressive darkness. "But look at this. The last video they recorded." He tapped the screen. The video was short, only about 15 seconds long. It was dark, filmed from inside the car, looking out the windshield. The only audio was the car's engine humming and a soft, rhythmic sound from outside. It was a gentle, melodic humming, almost like a lullaby. It was calming, yet deeply unsettling in the context of their disappearance. And then, a woman's voice, Chloe's presumably, whispered, "Liam, do you hear that? It's beautiful." The video ended. Silence flooded the room once more, thicker than before. The humming lingered in Jack's mind. It was a sound that didn't belong in the deep woods of Pennsylvania. "We need to go back to that service road," Jack said, his voice hard. "We missed something. Run a background check on the Sterlings. Deep dive. Finances, work history, social media. Did they know anyone in Pennsylvania? Did they have any interest in the occult, in local history? Anything." As Evans scurried off to his computer, Jack turned back to Brody. His skepticism was eroding, replaced by a gnawing unease. "This humming, you ever heard anything like it?" Brody's face was grim. He nodded slowly. "It's the Song of the Falls." "What falls?" "Whispering Falls. The place that doesn't exist." "Oh, it exists, Callahan," Brody said, his eyes distant, as if looking back through time. "The path is gone, swallowed by the woods. But the water still runs. The old folks said the falls would sing to you, lure you in. They said it was the voices of those the mountain had claimed, whispering to the next to join them." Jack grabbed his coat. He was a man of logic, a creature of the city where every mystery had a rational, human explanation. But here in Havenwood Gap, the line between the rational and the impossible was beginning to blur. The woods were calling, and he was starting to understand how Liam and Chloe Sterling might have been compelled to answer. He paused at the door, turning back to the evidence bag on his desk. The twig doll seemed to mock him from within its plastic prison. It was a piece of the puzzle, but a piece from a box he didn't know how to open. As he headed back out into the encroaching twilight, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just investigating a disappearance. He was stepping into a story that had been waiting patiently in the shadows of the mountains for someone new to listen. Dusk was bleeding through the dense canopy of the forest, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The woods transform at this hour, shapes softening into shadows, and every rustle of leaves sounding like a footstep. Detective Jack Callahan and Sheriff Brody were back on the decommissioned service road, the silver Subaru now gone, towed back to the impound lot for a more thorough forensic sweep. All that remained were tire tracks in the mud and a profound sense of violation. "The trail to the falls would have started somewhere around here," Brody said, his voice a low rumble. He pointed with a weathered hand towards a section of the woods that looked no different from the rest. "The county fenced it off in the 70s, but a fence is no match for 60 years of nature." Jack swept the area with his powerful flashlight, its beam cutting a sharp, sterile cone through the gathering gloom. He was operating on a hunch, Brody's hunch, to be precise. The humming in the video, the legend of the falls, the couple's GPS search, it was a trail of whispers, not evidence. But it was the only trail they had. "What are we looking for, exactly?" Jack asked, pushing aside a low-hanging branch laced with spiderwebs. "A signpost that says, 'This way to the mythical waterfall'?" "We're looking for a break in the pattern," Brody replied patiently, his eyes scanning the forest floor. "A game trail that's a little too wide. An old stone marker. A tree that doesn't belong." They moved in silence for a while, the only sounds their breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. Jack's mind was a whirlwind of contradictions. His training screamed that Liam and Chloe were victims of a very human predator who had lured them off the highway. But the scene in the car, the lack of struggle, the strange melodic humming, none of it fit a standard abduction profile. It was Brody who found it. "Here," he called out, his voice sharp. Jack made his way over. At the base of a gnarled black walnut tree, almost completely swallowed by moss and thyme, was a small, flat stone. Carved into its surface was a simple spiral symbol, faded but unmistakable. A petroglyph. Jack knelt, examining it. "Native American?" "No," Brody said, a grim tone in his voice. "That's an old settler's mark. It means a path starts here. A safe path, supposedly." He looked up, peering into the oppressive darkness of the trees. "This is it. The way to Whispering Falls." The path, once they knew what to look for, was barely there. It was more of an impression, a subtle parting in the undergrowth that hinted at a long-forgotten trail. As they pushed deeper, the air grew colder, and the ambient sounds of the nearby interstate faded away, replaced by an unnerving silence. It felt like stepping into another world, a place governed by older, quieter rules. After about 20 minutes of walking, Jack's flashlight beam caught a flicker of color on the ground. He stopped, crouching down. Tangled in the thorns of a wild raspberry bush was a strip of fabric. It was a silk scarf, patterned with small, painted birds. "Check the photos on their phone," Jack said into his radio to Deputy Evans back at the station. Look for a picture of Chloe Sterling. See if she's wearing a scarf like this." The radio crackled back to life a few moments later, Evans's voice tinny and distant. "Affirmative, detective. Found one on her social media. Posted 2 days ago at a gas station in Ohio. She's wearing that exact scarf. It's theirs, no doubt about it." A shiver traced its way down Jack's spine. This was it. Hard proof. Liam and Chloe had walked this path. They had come this way, drawn deeper into the woods. But why? The answer, he felt, lay at the end of this trail. He stood up, his senses on high alert. And that's when he heard it. It started so faintly he thought it was the wind, or a ringing in his own ears. A low, resonant hum. It wasn't mechanical. It was melodic, almost musical, a single, sustained chord that seemed to emanate from the very trees around them. He froze, holding his breath, and looked at Brody. The old sheriff's eyes were wide, fixed on the darkness ahead. He had heard it too. It was the sound from the video. The beautiful, hypnotic humming that Chloe had recorded. But hearing it through a phone's tiny speaker was nothing like this. Out here in the cold, dark woods, the sound vibrated through the soles of his feet. It was a physical presence. It wasn't just a sound to be heard, it was a thing to be felt. It pulled at some deep primal part of his mind, promising peace, tranquility, and an end to all worry. It was a siren song, sung by a river and a mountain. "Brody," Jack whispered, his own voice sounding foreign. "What is that?" The sheriff didn't look at him. His gaze was locked on the path ahead, where the humming seemed to be getting stronger, clearer. It was beckoning them forward, inviting them to come closer, to see the source of the beautiful music, to see what Liam and Chloe had seen. "That," Brody said, his voice heavy with the weight of generations of fear, "is the falls. It's singing." The humming was a living thing. It wrapped around Jack Callahan, a physical pressure against his eardrums, pulling him forward. His police training, every rational instinct he possessed, was screaming at him to stop, to fall back and wait for daylight and a full search team. But the mystery was a hook, and the hypnotic sound was the line, reeling him in. He looked at Brody, whose face was a mask of grim resolution. The sheriff, for all his talk of folklore, was not a man to abandon a trail. "We go slow," Jack said, his voice barely a whisper, as if a loud noise might break the spell. "Flashlights on the ground. Watch every step." Brody just nodded, his hand resting on the holstered pistol at his hip. It was a gesture that offered little comfort in a place where the threat didn't feel like something a bullet could stop. They followed the sound for another 100 yards, the overgrown path opening into a small, unnaturally clear basin. And there it was. Whispering Falls. It wasn't the majestic cascade Jack had imagined. It was a series of low, wide tiers of black, glistening rock, veiled in a perpetual mist. Water flowed over them not with a roar, but with a strange, resonant harmony. It was as if the stones themselves were singing, the water acting as a bow on a string. The acoustics of the basin amplified the sound, making it feel like it was coming from everywhere at once. The air was heavy with the smell of wet stone and damp earth. In the center of the clearing, near the pool at the base of the falls, the ground was disturbed. A small, makeshift camp was set up, but it looked nothing like a hiker's rest stop. There were no tents, no sleeping bags. Instead, a circle of stones had been laid out carefully. And inside the circle, dozens of them were scattered on the ground. Twig dolls, identical to the one Jack had found by the car. It looked like a shrine, an offering. Jack's flashlight beam fell on an object lying next to the circle of stones. It was a leather-bound journal, its pages warped by the damp air. He knelt, picking it up with a gloved hand. It was a sketchbook, filled with charcoal drawings and handwritten notes. He flipped through the pages. The drawings were unsettling. Sketches of the woods, the falls, the twig dolls. But they were interspersed with frantic, almost desperate-looking drawings of the spiral symbol they had found on the marker stone. On one page, a family tree was meticulously drawn out. At the top was the name Liam Sterling. Below it, the lineage went back, generation after generation, until it reached a name from the late 1700s, Elias Stern. Jack's radio crackled, the sound sharp and violent in the humming stillness. It was Evans. "Detective, you're not gonna believe this," the deputy's voice was breathless. "I ran that deep dive on the Sterlings. Liam's background, his family isn't from Oregon. Not originally. I cross-referenced his genealogy project. He was a history buff, with the town archives. His ancestors were from here. From Havenwood Gap." Jack stared at the family tree in the journal, a cold dread washing over him. "Let me guess. His original family name was Stern." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the radio. "Yeah, how did you know?" The Stern family was one of the first to settle this hollow. They all disappeared in the winter of 1788. The official record says it was a raid, but the local legend, says the mountain took them, claimed them. Sir, the family vanished from the very land where you're standing right now. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't a random stop. This was a pilgrimage. Liam Sterling had been drawn back here, to the place where his family's story had ended, searching for an answer. And he had brought Chloe with him. Jack flipped to the last page of the journal. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. The song is just like the old letters described. It calms the fear. Chloe hears it too. She says it's beautiful. They say the falls demand a price for safe passage. A promise. An offering, so the family line can continue. The watchers in the woods are waiting. I see their eyes. They aren't hostile. They are guardians. We have to honor the old pact. We have to step through the water. It's the only way home. Step through the water, Jack whispered, looking at the shimmering black pool at the base of the falls. Suddenly, the humming changed. The melodic, calming tone vanished, replaced by a grating, dissonant chord that scraped at the nerves. The air grew heavy, oppressive. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. Instinctively, Jack and Brody snapped their flashlights up from the ground, sweeping them across the darkness at the edge of the clearing. Beams cut through the mist, illuminating the impenetrable wall of ancient trees. And then they saw them. Just at the edge of the light, half hidden behind the trees, were the eyes. Dozens of them. Pairs of pale, luminous pinpricks of light, reflecting the flashlight beams. They were suspended in the darkness, unblinking, silent. And they were too high off the ground to belong to any animal Jack had ever seen. They were the same eyes from the photograph on Liam's phone. The Watchers. The Guardians. They weren't moving, they weren't making a sound. They were simply there, a silent, terrifying jury in the deep, dark woods, and Jack knew with a certainty that chilled him to his very soul that he and Brody had just trespassed into their courtroom. Time seemed to freeze in the misty basin of Whispering Falls. The air, once filled with a hypnotic melody, was now a razor's edge of dissonant sound. Detective Jack Callahan's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the terrible hum of the falls. His hand, slick with sweat, gripped his service pistol, but he didn't draw it. What could a bullet do to a dozen pairs of unblinking, luminous eyes? Sheriff Brody stood beside him, a statue carved from mountain rock. He wasn't looking at any single pair of eyes, but at the entire, terrifying panorama. He raised a hand slowly, not in surrender, but in a gesture that Jack couldn't interpret, a sign of respect, perhaps, or acknowledgement. "We don't run," Brody breathed, his voice impossibly calm. "We show them we are leaving their ground. Back away. Slow." Jack's entire being screamed at him to turn and sprint, but he trusted the old sheriff's instincts. This was Brody's world, governed by rules Jack was only just beginning to comprehend. With his flashlight beam still pointed forward, illuminating the silent watchers, Jack took a single, deliberate step backward. Then another. The eyes didn't move. They just watched. The silence was absolute, broken only by the grating hum of the falls and the crunch of their own footsteps on the damp earth. They backed out of the clearing, step by agonizing step, until the tree line began to obscure their view of the ritual circle and the dark, shimmering pool. As they re-entered the narrow, overgrown path, the dissonant hum of the falls began to fade, but the eyes did not. The pairs of glowing lights detached from the darkness of the basin and began to move, flanking them on both sides, keeping pace with them through the dense undergrowth. They were silent escorts, ghostly sentinels ensuring the intruders left their domain. Jack could feel their gaze on him, a weight heavier than any physical touch. He had never felt so much like prey in his life. They had retreated about halfway back to the service road when the humming from the falls stopped completely. The sudden, total silence was more jarring than the noise had been. The woods were deathly still, and in that silence, a new sound drifted through the trees. It was a whisper, carried on a phantom breeze. A single, clear, female voice, echoing with a strange, ethereal quality. "The pact is honored." It was Chloe Sterling's voice. Jack would have sworn to it in any court of law, but it wasn't the voice of a terrified, lost woman. It was serene, resigned, final. He and Brody froze, exchanging a look of pure, unadulterated shock. Before either of them could speak, the glowing eyes in the woods vanished. Not one by one, but all at once, as if a switch had been flicked, plunging the forest back into a simple, natural darkness. They were alone. They didn't wait to question it. They moved quickly now, their long strides eating up the rest of the path until they burst out onto the gravel of the service road. The sight of their cruiser, a solid man-made machine of steel and glass, was the most beautiful thing Jack had ever seen. They scrambled inside, locking the doors, the silence of the cab a welcome relief. Neither man spoke on the drive back to the station. What was there to say? How could you put words to what they had just witnessed? Back in the sterile fluorescent light of the sheriff's office, the experience felt like a fever dream. Jack slumped into a chair, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled off his mud-caked boots. He, Detective Jack Callahan, a man who believed in evidence, fingerprints, and motive, had just been escorted through a haunted forest by supernatural entities after hearing a ghost whisper on the wind. How do I write a report about this, Brody? Jack asked the ceiling. Suspects identified as multiple pairs of glowing eyes. Witness reports a disembodied voice. They'll send me for a psychiatric evaluation. You don't write that report, Brody said, pouring 2 cups of black, sludgy coffee. Not yet. We write that we followed a trail, found the couple's journal, and were forced to retreat due to dangerous terrain and low visibility. We used the truth to hide the truth. Just then, Deputy Evans came rushing in from the records room, his face pale, a stack of dusty file folders in his hands. Sir, he said, his voice shaky, I kept digging. I thought, if the Stern family disappeared, maybe others did too. I started searching old county records, coroner's reports, missing persons files, going back as far as I could. He dropped a folder on Jack's desk. It was brittle with age, the label written in faded cursive, Disappearance, Holloway Family, October 1950. Evans opened another. Vance Party, Missing, October 1875. Another. Brotherhood of Miners, Vanished, October 1800. Each file told a similar story. A family, a group of people, disappearing without a trace from the woods around Havenwood Gap. No bodies ever found. Each disappearance occurred in the last week of October, and each one was separated by exactly 75 years. Jack stared at the dates, a cold mathematical dread creeping up his spine. 1800, 1875, 1950, and now the current year. 75 years later. It's a cycle, Jack breathed, looking at Brody. A pattern. Liam Sterling wasn't just coming back to find his family's history. He was coming back to complete it. Evans swallowed hard. There's more, he said, pushing one last document forward. It was a copy of Elias Stern's original colonial land grant from 1788. Attached to it was a sworn affidavit from a neighboring homesteader. It described a pact the Stern family had made with the land, or whatever was in it. A promise of prosperity, a safe haven in the harsh new world, in exchange for a tithe. A sacrifice, paid every 75 years, to keep the guardians of the falls appeased. The last line of the affidavit read, they did not see it as a death, but a homecoming. A family chosen, one by one, to return to the heart of the mountain. The fluorescent lights of the Havenwood Gap Sheriff's Department hummed, a flat, monotonous sound that did nothing to fill the echoing silence in the room. The old files lay spread across Jack Callahan's desk like ancient tombstones, each one a testament to a truth so monstrous it defied belief. A 75-year cycle. A tithe. A pact. The words belonged in a horror novel, not a police report. Jack felt adrift, a detective without a crime, a lawman without a law to enforce. How do you arrest a piece of folklore? How do you issue a warrant for a ghost? Sheriff Brody, however, seemed less shocked and more grimly focused, as if he had finally found a map to a land he'd always known existed just beyond the veil. We're looking at this all wrong, Callahan, Brody said, his voice raspy. We're cops. We're trained to look for criminals, for motive, for a human element. This isn't human. Not in the way we understand it. We need someone who speaks the language of the mountain. And who would that be? Jack asked, the sarcasm in his voice thin and brittle. A psychic? A ghost hunter? No, Brody said, shaking his head. We need a historian, but not the kind that writes the official town history. We need the one who collects the whispers. He paused, looking at the name on one of the old folders. We need to talk to Elara Vance. The name rang a bell. Elara Vance, the town's semi-retired librarian and the obsessive, unofficial curator of the Havenwood Historical Society. She was a woman who lived more in the past than the present. And her last name was the same as the family who had vanished in 1875. Her house was on the edge of town, a crooked saltbox structure shrouded by overgrown ivy and ancient oak trees. It felt less like a home and more like an extension of the forest itself. When she opened the door, Jack understood why. Ilara Vance was a woman with eyes as old as the mountains, clear and sharp. She was frail, but carried herself with an unshakable stillness. She looked at Brody, then at Jack, and a flicker of something, recognition or perhaps resignation, passed across her face. "I was wondering when the cycle would bring the law to my door," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Come in. The kettle is on." Her living room was a labyrinth of books. They were stacked on shelves that reached the ceiling, piled on every available surface, their spines cracked with age. Old maps were framed on the walls, their paper yellowed and brittle. The air smelled of old paper, dried herbs, and Earl Grey tea. "You are a Vance," Brody stated simply as she poured them tea. "My great-grandfather was the only one who didn't go on that hunting trip in 1875, she said, her eyes distant. "He was sick with a fever. He said he could hear the mountains singing them away. No one believed him. Our family has been watching and listening ever since." Jack pulled out Liam Sterling's journal and the photo of the twig doll. He explained everything they had seen, everything they had discovered. He expected shock, disbelief. Instead, Ilara just nodded slowly, as if he were confirming a story she had known her entire life. "The pact is not with the land itself," she began, her fingers tracing the spiral symbol in one of her own ancient books. "It's with the Guardians, the Watchers. They are old. Older than the trees, older than the river. They were here before us, and they will be here after." The Stern family, in their desperation to survive their first winter, made a deal. "Prosperity for sacrifice," Jack murmured, recalling the affidavit. "A tithe, yes," Ilara corrected gently. "But not a sacrifice in the way you think. It wasn't murder. It was an agreement. The Guardians protect this valley. They keep the worst of the world out. The sicknesses, the famines, the great fires that ravaged other settlements, they never truly touched Havenwood Gap. The town prospers. In return, every 75 years, the bloodline that made the pact must offer a tithe to renew it. They are not killed. They are taken, preserved, made part of the mountain. It is, as Liam Sterling wrote in his journal, a homecoming." "So Liam and Chloe, they went willingly?" Jack asked, struggling to accept it. Liam knew his history. He was fulfilling his family's oldest duty. And the woman he chose, Chloe, she chose to join him. The Guardians do not take the unwilling. Ilara's expression grew dark. "But the ritual is not yet complete." A new, cold fear gripped Jack. "What do you mean?" "The return of the bloodline is the catalyst. It awakens the Guardians and opens the gateways," she explained. "But the pact requires more than just the blood. It requires a witness, an offering from the town that has prospered under their protection. Liam and Chloe were the key. But the door, once opened, must be satisfied." She unrolled a massive, hand-drawn map of the valley on her table. It was covered in annotations and symbols. The Guardians don't just stay at the falls. During the cycle, their influence spreads. They can manifest at other places of power, other conduits. She pointed to several locations marked with the familiar, chilling spiral. Here, the old quarry, and here, the standing stones on Miller's Ridge, and here. Before she could finish, Jack's police radio, which he'd clipped to his belt, crackled to life, shredding the quiet of the room. It was Deputy Evans, his voice frantic. "Detective, Sheriff, we've got a priority call. A 911 ping from a cell phone. It's the Henderson family. They were camping for the weekend up on Miller's Ridge. Their teenage daughter just called, hysterical. She said her parents went to check on a strange humming sound in the woods a few minutes ago. Now they're gone. And she says there are eyes in the trees." The quiet, book-filled room in Ilara Vance's house shattered into a vortex of adrenaline and fear. The frantic voice of the Henderson girl over the radio was a chilling echo of Chloe Sterling's story, but this time it was happening now, in real time. This wasn't history. It was a hunt. "Miller's Ridge is on the other side of the valley," Brody said, his voice a low growl as he grabbed his keys. He was already in sheriff mode, the grim historian replaced by the protector. "It'll take us 20 minutes, even with lights and sirens." "The Guardians are fast when the cycle is open," Ilara warned, her ancient eyes filled with a new urgency. "They don't walk. They are simply there. You must understand, you are not going to a crime scene. You are walking into a harvest." "I'm going with you," she stated, grabbing a heavy wool coat. "You will need a translator, and I'm the only one left." The drive to Miller's Ridge was a frantic blur of winding mountain roads. Jack's mind raced, trying to fit the unfolding nightmare into some kind of operational procedure. There was none. His mission was to save a girl from monsters he couldn't see and rescue parents who may have walked willingly into the arms of a local legend. They found the campsite easily, guided by the flickering light of a dying campfire. The scene was one of quiet chaos. Camping chairs were knocked over. A half-eaten plate of food sat on a picnic table. The flap of the main tent whipped violently in the wind. Of Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, there was no sign. "Sarah, this is the sheriff's department," Brody called out, his voice echoing off the silent stones of the ridge. A choked sob came from inside the family's small camper. Jack pushed the door open to find a teenage girl huddled in a corner, her phone clutched in her hand like a talisman. She couldn't have been more than 16, her face pale and streaked with tears. "They're gone," she whispered, her body trembling uncontrollably. "The music, it started a little while ago. Mom said it was beautiful. Dad just got up and started walking towards the trees. He didn't even put his shoes on. Mom tried to stop him, but then she took his hand and went with him." "Did you see anyone else, Sarah?" Jack asked, his voice gentle. "No," she sobbed. "Just the lights. In the trees. Like 100 pairs of yellow eyes. They're still out there. Watching." Jack stepped outside, sweeping his flashlight beam across the perimeter of the woods. He saw nothing, but he could feel it. The oppressive, silent weight of being observed. It was Alara who found the new sign. At the edge of the campsite, where the forest began, a massive granite boulder was embedded in the earth. Freshly carved into its surface was the spiral symbol. But unlike the faded ancient marker on the trail to the falls, this one seemed alive. It pulsed with a faint, internal, silvery light, casting an ethereal glow on the surrounding moss. "The conduit is active," Alara breathed, her hand hovering over the glowing symbol without touching it. "This is how they travel, how they extend their reach. They are drawing the Hendersons through." "Drawing them where?" Brody demanded. "Back to the heart. Back to the falls," Alara explained, her gaze distant. "The tithe is being gathered. They are not dead, Sheriff. They are in a state of transition. They are part of a procession now. You cannot simply go in and pull them out. To interfere with the tithe is to break the pact. So what are we supposed to do? Let the mountain just swallow these people?" Jack shot back, his frustration boiling over. Breaking the pact could unleash something far worse on this valley than a disappearance every 75 years, Alara countered, her voice sharp as broken glass. "For centuries, this town has been an island of peace in a world of chaos. That peace has a price. What Liam Sterling and his ancestors understood is that you cannot fight the mountain. You can only pay its due." A terrible choice began to dawn on Jack. He was a police officer sworn to protect and serve. But who was he serving? The Hendersons? Or the entire town of Havenwood Gap, whose quiet prosperity was apparently bought and paid for with a recurring human sacrifice? His radio crackled again, but this time it was Deputy Evans, and the professional calm in his voice was gone. He sounded terrified. "Sheriff, detective, I had a thought. I wanted to make sure, given the situation. I decided to do a wellness check on your wife, Sheriff. On Martha." Brody went rigid, his face draining of all color. "What is it, Evans?" "There's no answer at the house, sir," Evans said, his voice cracking. I'm on your front porch right now. The door is wide open. The lights are on. Sir, there's one of those little twig dolls sitting right here on the doormat." The world narrowed to a single sharp point of sound, Deputy Evans's voice on the radio, speaking of a twig doll on a doormat. For Detective Jack Callahan, the blood ran cold. But for Sheriff Brody, it was as if the mountain itself had reached down and ripped the heart from his chest. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a gray, stony mask of disbelief and horror. The stoic, unshakable lawman was gone, replaced by a husband terrified for his wife. "Martha," he breathed, the name a ragged whisper. He turned, his eyes wide and lost, looking not at Jack or Alara, but through them, towards his home on the other side of the valley. "They wouldn't," he stammered, his voice cracking. "She's not part of this. She's not blood. The pact is with the Stearns, the Vances, not us." "The pact is with the valley, Sheriff," Alara Vance said, her voice soft but firm, cutting through his denial. "The bloodline opens the door, but the guardians claim what is offered. Or what they choose. The Henderson family had no connection to the pact, yet they were chosen. The guardians are gathering the tithe, and this time, their reach is wider than ever before." The implication was horrifying. The guardians were not just collecting descendants of a single family. They were collecting a tithe from the town itself, from the people who had unknowingly benefited from the ancient agreement. And they had chosen the sheriff's wife. Without another word, Brody turned and ran to his cruiser, his movements stiff and mechanical. Jack was right behind him. "Brody, wait. You can't go alone." But the sheriff wasn't listening. He threw the cruiser into gear, the tires spitting gravel as he sped away from Miller's Ridge, leaving Jack, Elara, and the terrified Henderson girl in the eerie, silent campsite. "Damn it!" Jack yelled into the empty night. He was stranded, miles from town, with a supernatural crisis spiraling out of control. "He's making a mistake," Elara said, her gaze fixed on the glowing spiral on the boulder. "You cannot confront them with anger. You cannot force them. It will only make it worse. So what's the alternative? Let them take her," Jack demanded, his own fear turning to anger. "The alternatives are few, and all are terrible," Elara replied, her ancient eyes meeting his. "We can try to reason with them, offer something else in her place. An alternative tithe. But it must be of equal value." "Value? What does that even mean to them? What do they value?" "Life," she said simply. "Connection to this place. The sheriff's wife has lived here her entire life. Her roots are deep in this soil. She is a part of this valley. That is what they value. To them, she is a perfect offering." A dreadful understanding began to dawn on Jack. He thought of his own life. He was an outsider, a transplant from the city. He had no roots here, no connection to this place beyond his temporary assignment. To the guardians, he was worthless. A ghost passing through. But Brody was like his wife, born and raised in the shadow of these mountains. Meanwhile, Sheriff Brody drove with a reckless abandon he hadn't felt since he was a teenager. The winding roads were a blur. His mind was a maelstrom of fear and denial. He saw his front porch in his mind's eye, the door hanging open, the small, terrible twig doll sitting in judgment. He screeched to a halt in his driveway. The scene was exactly as Evans had described. The house was bathed in a warm, inviting light, but the open door was a gaping wound. He drew his pistol, his training kicking in on autopilot, and stormed inside. "Martha!" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. The house was still. A half-finished cup of tea sat on the kitchen counter, still warm. Her favorite blanket was draped over the armchair where she would read every evening. Everything was in its place, except for her. He ran through the house, his desperation growing with every empty room. Finally, he came to the back door, which led out into their garden. It was also wide open, and on the stone patio, he saw it. It was a line of pebbles, arranged in a perfect, deliberate spiral on the ground. And in the center of the spiral lay his wife's wedding ring. Brody fell to his knees, his weapon forgotten, his breath catching in a sob. He had spent his life protecting this town from threats he could see, threats he understood. But the one that mattered, the one that had come for his wife, had been here all along, sleeping under the soil, and he had never even known. He looked up at the dark, looming silhouette of the mountains that encircled his home. He could almost feel them watching him, waiting. He had been the sheriff of this valley for 30 years. He was its protector. And now, the valley had come to collect its due from him personally. His rage, his fear, it all melted away, replaced by a profound, soul-crushing despair. He finally understood. You don't fight the mountain. The mountain always wins. The taillights of Sheriff Brody's cruiser vanished into the oppressive darkness, leaving Detective Jack Callahan on Miller's Ridge in a profound and terrifying silence. He was standing on an active supernatural conduit, next to a woman who spoke of ancient pacts as if they were weather reports, and he was responsible for a teenage girl catatonic with fear. His world had been turned inside out. The rules of his profession were meaningless here. "We can't stay here," Jack said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the sea of chaos. He looked at Elara Vance. "Your knowledge is the only weapon we have. And I need to get this girl, Sarah, somewhere safe." Elara nodded, her ancient eyes sharp and focused. "My home. It is warded. The old symbols are carved into the foundation. It is the safest place in Havenwood Gap right now." The journey back to town was thick with tension. Jack drove Elara's old, sturdy station wagon, with a silent, trembling Sarah Henderson wrapped in a blanket in the back. Jack kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was on the woods, on the feeling of being watched, which hadn't entirely disappeared. He felt like a mouse scurrying across a floor while the hawk circles silently overhead. Back in the labyrinth of books that was Elara's home, the historian brewed another pot of strong tea. Sarah was settled into an armchair, a heavy quilt pulled up to her chin, her eyes wide and vacant. Brody is acting on grief and rage, Jack said, pacing the floor between stacks of books. He'll get himself killed or taken. We can't fight them. Your words. So what's the plan? The plan is to stop thinking like a cop and start thinking like a scholar, Elara replied, pushing a massive leather-bound book across her heavy oak table. You can't fight a force of nature, but you can learn to predict its tides. We need to understand the exact terms of the pact. Its rules. Its limits. For the next few hours, Elara's living room became a desperate command center. Jack, guided by Elara, dove into the abyss of Havenwood Gap's hidden history. He read the brittle yellowed pages of personal diaries from the 1800s, traced family lines in town ledgers, and examined hand-drawn maps that showed the valley not as a collection of properties, but as a living entity of power. He learned that the tithe wasn't a random number. According to a journal kept by Elara's great-grandfather, the tithe was always a hand of souls. 5 people. Liam and Chloe were the first 2. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson were 3 and 4. They needed one more. Martha Brody, Jack whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. She was the 5th. The tithe is complete. Yes, Elara said grimly. Which means the next stage is about to begin. The procession. She pulled out another map, this one showing the conduits, the falls, the ridge, the quarry, as stars in a constellation. Lines were drawn between them, forming a pattern. The chosen are not gone. They are being held at the conduits, in a state between worlds. At dawn, they will be drawn together. A final procession to the heart, to Whispering Falls, where the pact will be sealed for another 75 years. So we have until dawn, Jack said, a sliver of hope cutting through his despair. If we can get to them before they reach the falls. Interrupting the procession would be catastrophic, Elara warned. It would break the pact. The Guardian's protection over the valley would vanish. The consequences are unimaginable. It's better than sacrificing 5 innocent people. Jack retorted. Are they still innocent? Elara posed quietly. They are chosen. According to this, they are serene. They feel no fear. They are part of something ancient and, in its own terrible way, sacred. Jack's phone buzzed violently on the table, startling them both. It was Deputy Evans. His voice was hushed, but electric with discovery. Detective, I've been digging like you said, looking for patterns. I started cross-referencing the ownership records for the land around the conduits. Miller's Ridge, the old quarry, the land bordering the state forest where the falls are. And what did you find? Jack asked, leaning over the phone. It's the names, sir. For the last 200 years, the deeds have been passed down through just a few families. The Stearns, of course. A few others. But one name is always there. On every single one. Not as the primary owner, but as a trustee. A signatory on every sale, every transfer, going back to the late 1700s. What's the name, Evans? Jack demanded, his eyes locking with Elara's across the table. There was a pause, and the rustle of old paper. It's Vance, sir, Evans said. Every single deed has been co-signed by an ancestor of Elara Vance. Her family, they aren't just historians. It's like they're the caretakers. The wardens of the whole damn thing. Jack slowly lowered the phone. He looked at the frail, elderly woman who had been his guide through this nightmare. She hadn't been just a keeper of whispers. She was a keeper of the pact itself. Her family hadn't been just watching from the sidelines. They had been managing it. And a cold, terrible question rose in his mind. Was she helping him save the victims, or was she ensuring the tithe was paid? Deputy Evans's words echoed in the sudden, deafening silence of Elara Vance's study. Warden. Caretaker. The room, once a sanctuary of knowledge, instantly felt like a cage, and Jack Callahan was trapped inside with the spider at the center of the web. He looked at Elara, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw past the frail, scholarly woman to the ancient, unwavering strength beneath. You knew, Jack said, his voice dangerously low. All of it. You knew Liam Sterling was coming. You knew the cycle was starting again. You haven't been helping me solve a mystery. You've been documenting it. Elara didn't flinch. She slowly placed her teacup back on its saucer, the soft click of porcelain on china the only sound. My family has never interfered, Detective. We only watch. We record. We are the memory of this valley. That is the role my ancestors chose. Chose? Jack's voice rose, laced with disbelief. You chose to stand by while people are sacrificed to some ancient entity? The choice was made 200 years ago, she replied, her gaze unflinching. After the first few cycles, my ancestor, Jonathan Vance, saw the chaos. The Guardians, left to their own devices, took indiscriminately. The pact was primal, untamed. Our family learned to understand it, to read its signs. We became its caretakers to ensure it remained contained. We ensure the tithe is only what is required, and nothing more. We are not the executioners, detective. We are the dam that holds back the flood. Her calm, pragmatic explanation was more horrifying than any monstrous confession. She wasn't a villain, she was something far more complex. She was a warden of an ancient prison, and her duty was to the prison, not to the inmates. So you're just going to let it happen, Jack stated, the reality of his situation crashing down on him. Brody's wife, the Hendersons, you'll just add their names to your books. It is their part to play, as it is mine to record it, Ilara said, a deep sadness in her voice. The peace of this valley is a delicate thing. To break the pact now would unleash a century of contained darkness. I am protecting the many at the cost of the few. It is a terrible calculus, but one my family has had to make for generations. Jack felt a profound sense of isolation. Brody was broken. Evans was just a voice on the radio, and his only expert, his guide, was an accomplice to the very force he was trying to fight. He was alone. His gaze drifted to the armchair where Sarah Henderson was now fitfully sleeping, whimpering softly. He had saved her, but for what? To live in a town protected by a recurring nightmare? He couldn't accept it. His entire being, every fiber of his identity as a protector, rebelled against the cold logic of the pact. He turned back to the table, to the maps and the ancient books, his mind racing. You said the Guardians value life with deep roots in this valley, Jack said, thinking aloud. You said interfering with the procession would be catastrophic. But you never said the terms of the pact were unchangeable. Ilara's composure flickered for the first time. A hint of surprise, perhaps even fear, entered her eyes. The pact is ancient. It is bound to the bloodline and the land itself. It cannot be changed. Everything can be changed, Jack countered, his hope igniting from a single, desperate spark. He grabbed Liam Sterling's journal and the copies of the old land deeds Evans had mentioned. He wasn't looking for a weapon anymore. He was looking for a loophole. He spread the documents out, his eyes scanning the spidery cursive of the 18th century scribes. He saw the terms, the granting of the land to the Stern family, the signatory mark of the first Vance. He cross-referenced it with Ilara's great-grandfather's diary. And then he saw it. A single, cryptic line in the diary, written in a shaky hand. The pact is sealed by the blood and the witness. Should the witness fail in their duty, or the line be broken, a new warden must be named, lest the Guardians choose their own and the valley be consumed. A new warden, Jack whispered, looking up at Ilara, whose face had gone pale. It is a forgotten clause, she said, her voice barely audible. A fail-safe that has never been enacted. To name a new warden requires an incredible sacrifice. A voluntary offering. What kind of offering? Jack pressed, his heart pounding. The new warden must willingly bind themselves to the valley, Ilara explained, her voice trembling. They must forsake all other life, all other places. They must become an anchor for the Guardian's power, a new caretaker for the pact. They must offer their own life, not in death, but in service. An eternity spent as the memory of the mountain. Jack stared at the sleeping form of Sarah Henderson, at the town map, at the faces of Liam and Chloe in his mind. He thought of Brody's wife Martha, walking serenely into the woods. He could save them. He could break the cycle of sacrifice. But the price was absolute. He looked at Ilara, the current, weary warden. So the procession at dawn, it's not just to seal the pact. It's to reaffirm the warden's authority. Yes, she admitted. My presence there is required as the witness. A wild, desperate plan began to form in Jack's mind. It was insane. It was impossible. But it was the only path he could see that didn't end in sacrifice or catastrophe. Then I guess you and I have somewhere to be at dawn, Jack said, his voice filled with a newfound, terrifying resolve. It's time to renegotiate the terms of this deal. The world was gray and still, holding its breath just before the dawn. When Detective Jack Callahan stepped out of the warded safety of Ilara Vance's home, the air was ice-cold, sharp in his lungs. He was not alone. Ilara was beside him, her face set with a grim certainty of fate. They had one desperate destination, and a deadline set by the rising sun, Whispering Falls. As Ilara's old station wagon rumbled down the dark, winding road toward the forest, the headlights cut through the gloom and landed on a familiar shape. Sheriff Brody's cruiser was parked on the shoulder of the abandoned service road, its engine cold and silent. Inside, Brody sat behind the wheel, staring forward with a hollow, empty gaze. He was a man who had been completely and utterly broken. Jack stopped their car and walked over. Brody lowered the window, and a wave of cold despair seemed to flow out of the vehicle. "Don't go, Callahan," Brody whispered, his voice hoarse. "You can't fight it. I tried. I ran into the woods with my gun drawn, but there's nothing to shoot. There's just a feeling that you're an ant, and the mountain is just watching." "I'm not going to fight it, Brody," Jack said, his own voice steady. "I'm going to talk to it." A sad, humorless smile touched Brody's lips. "The mountain doesn't talk, son. It just takes." Leaving the sheriff to his grief, Jack and Alara proceeded down the overgrown path into the heart of the woods. The humming began again, faint at first, then growing in power. But the tone had shifted. It was no longer hypnotic or dissonant. It was solemn, liturgical, and immense. It was the sound of a sacred ceremony about to reach its conclusion. When they reached the basin of the falls, the scene stopped Jack's heart. The water of Whispering Falls cascaded over the black stones, its song now a powerful, resonant chant that filled the air with a palpable energy. And standing before the falls, arranged in a neat line, were the 5 chosen. Liam and Chloe Sterling, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, and Martha Brody. They stood perfectly still, their faces turned towards the cascading water, their expressions not of fear, but of absolute peace, as if they were witnessing a profound miracle. And in the tree lean, encircling the entire clearing, were the eyes. Countless pairs of pale, luminous lights, watching the proceedings in absolute silence. The ancient guardians were gathered to witness the renewal of their pact. "This is the procession," Alara whispered, her voice filled with a kind of reverent awe. "The pact will now be sealed." But Jack had not come to be a witness. He took a deep breath, the cold air steadying his nerves, and he stepped forward into the clearing. The moment his foot crossed the invisible threshold into the circle, the immense humming faltered. The air crackled. Every pair of eyes in the forest snapped to him. Even the 5 serene figures, who had seemed lost to the world, stirred, a collective tremor passing through them. Jack did not look at the people. He spoke to the falls, to the silent, watching eyes, to the ancient presence that saturated the very air he was breathing. His voice was clear and steady. "I have not come to break this pact," he announced into the charged silence. "I have come to honor it. But I am here to offer a new covenant." The humming stopped completely. The silence that followed was so profound it was a physical force, pressing in on him. "The fail-safe clause has been met," Jack called out, his voice echoing in the basin. "The witness has failed in her duty to protect the valley by allowing this cycle to continue unchallenged. A new warden must be named." He took another step forward. "I offer myself. I offer a new pact. Release these 5. Release them from their tithe, and I will take their place. Not as a sacrifice, but as your warden. A warden who protects, not just observes. Bind me to this valley. Let me be the anchor. This is my offer." He stood his ground, his heart hammering against his ribs, awaiting the judgment of a power older than time. The wind died. The water of the falls seemed to thin to a mere trickle. The silence stretched for an eternity. And then, a voice answered. It did not come from the trees or the falls. It spoke from inside his own mind, a voice that was old as stone and wind and memory itself. It spoke a single, chilling challenge. "Prove it." The 2 words hung in the vast, silent basin of Whispering Falls, a challenge issued by a power beyond human comprehension. Prove it. How could a mortal man prove his worth to a timeless entity? Detective Jack Callahan knew he couldn't win with force. He had to offer a sacrifice, a proof of his vow, absolute and irrevocable. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. He opened it and removed his detective's badge, the polished metal gleaming in the dim, pre-dawn light. It was the symbol of his identity, of his authority in the world he once knew. He stepped forward and placed it gently in the center of the stone circle Liam Sterling had made. Next, he took out the keys to his cruiser. They represented his freedom, his connection to the highways and the cities beyond these mountains, his ability to leave. He laid them next to the badge. Finally, he unholstered his service pistol. It was the tool of his trade, his answer to the violence and chaos of the human world. He didn't drop it. He carefully ejected the magazine and cleared the chamber, the metallic clicks unnaturally loud in the silence. He placed the empty weapon, the magazine, and the single unspent bullet on the ground, separate from each other. It was not an act of surrender, but a statement. He was laying down the laws of man to accept the laws of the mountain. He had offered his past, his future, and his power. He had nothing left to give but himself. He stood empty-handed and looked towards the darkness of the woods. "I forsake the world beyond this valley," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "I bind myself to this soil, to these stones. I will be the guardian of this pact. I will be the warden. This is my proof." For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence was so complete that Jack could hear the blood pounding in his own ears. Then, the change began. A low, resonant hum rose from the falls, but it was not the dissonant chord of a threat or the solemn chant of a ritual. It was a sound of deep, ancient peace, a vibration that seemed to settle the very air. In the tree-line, the countless pairs of glowing eyes softened. One by one, they began to fade, not in a sudden blink, but like stars being gently erased from the night sky. The watchers were satisfied. They were retreating. And then, the 5 figures in the procession stirred. A collective shudder ran through them. Martha Brody blinked, her head turning slowly from the falls. Her eyes, no longer vacant, found Jack's. A flicker of confused recognition crossed her face. "Jack," she whispered, her voice raspy. Mr. Henderson stumbled, looking down at his bare feet in disbelief. Liam and Chloe Sterling looked at each other, their serene trance replaced by a dazed, human disorientation. The spell was broken. The tithe had been refused. Elara Vance, her face etched with a relief so profound it looked painful, moved forward to help them, her role as warden now past. Her burden was finally lifted. She began to gently guide the confused and shivering group back down the path, away from the falls. Jack did not follow. He couldn't. He already felt a profound shift within himself. A new awareness flowed into him from the ground beneath his feet. He could feel the pulse of the water in the rock, the slow, sleeping life in the roots of the ancient trees, the quiet presence of every living creature in the valley. He was no longer just a man. He was an anchor. 1 year later, the official story of the Havenwood disappearances concluded with a strange, unsatisfying footnote. The missing persons, the Sterlings, the Hendersons, and Martha Brody, all reappeared a day later, wandering disoriented on a nearby access road. They had no memory of the event, chalking it up to a bizarre, shared episode of getting lost. Detective Jack Callahan, the promising city cop assigned to the case, was never seen again. His vehicle was found abandoned on a service road, making him the final, unexplained victim of the strange events on Route 80. He became a local legend, the city cop swallowed by the mountain. Sheriff Brody retired a month later, living a quiet life with his wife. He never spoke of that night, but sometimes he would look up at the mountains with an expression of deep, sorrowful understanding. Elara Vance continued her work at the Historical Society, the town's quiet, unassuming memory keeper. Only she knew the full truth. Sometimes, hikers on the less-traveled trails deep in the state forest would report a strange feeling of being watched, not with menace, but with a sense of protection. They'd speak of a man seen in the distance, who moved through the dense woods with an impossible silence and grace, leaving no tracks. He was the new warden. He no longer carried a badge or a gun. His duty was to the ancient pact, to maintain the balance. He was the protector of the valley, the guardian of its peace. And as the sun would set over the endless Pennsylvania ridges, he would stand by the singing waters of Whispering Falls, forever bound to his post, listening to the eternal song of the mountain he now called home.